Margaret stood at the altar in her ivory gown, her heart racing with anticipation as she waited for the moment that would change her life forever. The church was filled with white roses and the soft glow of candlelight, and she could hear the gentle murmur of guests settling into their seats. She had dreamed of this day since she was a little girl growing up in Lagos, never imagining that her journey would bring her here to Seoul, to this beautiful church, to marry the man she thought was the love of her life. Choi Dae-sung had swept her off her feet 2 years ago when they met at a business conference. He was charming, successful, and he made her feel like she was the only woman in the world. But as the minutes ticked by and the ceremony was delayed, a cold feeling of dread began to creep into her chest. The church doors burst open with a force that made everyone jump. Men in dark suits flooded in, their faces hard and expressionless, moving with the precision of soldiers. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she watched them fan out across the aisles, their hands resting ominously on their waists, where she could see the outline of weapons. The guests began to panic, some screaming, others trying to flee, but the men blocked every exit. Margaret turned to Dae-sung, expecting him to protect her, to do something, but what she saw in his eyes made her blood run cold. There was no surprise there, no fear, only a guilty resignation that told her everything she needed to know. She stumbled backward, her wedding bouquet falling from her trembling hands and scattering white petals across the marble floor. Dae-sung, what is this? What's happening? Her voice came out as a desperate whisper, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. A tall man emerged from the group, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit, his hair swept back, and his eyes were as cold as winter ice. He walked up the aisle with the confidence of someone who owned the world, and when he reached the altar, he looked at Margaret with an expression that was both calculating and oddly respectful. "Margaret Okafor," he said, his Korean accent precise and measured. "I am Kang Min-jun. You belong to me now." The words hit her like a physical blow. She looked around desperately for help, for someone to tell her this was a nightmare, but when her eyes found her mother and uncle sitting in the front row, they looked away. Her mother, Ngozi, who had always been so strong, so protective, sat with her head bowed, tears streaming down her face but making no move to help. Her uncle Chukwudi stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, but he too remained seated. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that Margaret felt her legs give way beneath her. Kang Min-jun gestured to his men, and they moved forward to take her arms. "No, no, please! Dae-sung, help me! Someone help me!" She fought against them, her screams echoing off the vaulted ceiling, but they were too strong. As they dragged her down the aisle, she twisted back to look at the man she was supposed to marry, and he finally met her gaze. In that moment, she saw the truth, written clearly across his face. He had sold her. Her fiancé, the man she had trusted with her heart, had sold her like cattle. The church doors closed behind her with a final, terrible thud, and Margaret's life as she knew it ended. She woke up in darkness so complete she thought she had gone blind. Panic seized her as she sat up, her hands frantically feeling around until they touched cold concrete walls. The room was small, windowless, and smelled of dampness and fear. Margaret's wedding dress was torn and dirty, the beautiful ivory silk now a mockery of the hope she had carried just hours before. She had no idea how long she had been unconscious or where she was. Her throat was raw from screaming, her wrists bruised from fighting against her captors. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could make out a thin line of light beneath what must be a door. She crawled toward it, her body aching, and pounded on the metal surface with all her strength. "Let me out! Please, somebody help me!" Her voice cracked and broke, but she kept screaming until her hands were numb and her voice was gone. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. She had no way of knowing. Finally, the door opened, flooding the room with harsh fluorescent light that made her eyes burn. Kang Min-jun stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 of his men. He looked at her with that same cold assessment, as if she were a piece of property he was evaluating. "Are you finished?" he asked calmly. Margaret pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly, her ruined dress hanging off her shoulders. "What do you want from me? Why am I here?" He stepped into the room, and his men closed the door behind him, standing guard. "You are here because of a debt, Margaret, a promise made by your father, Adekunle Okafor, before he died." The mention of her father's name made her flinch. Her father had passed away 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack, and his death had devastated their family. He had been a successful businessman, importing goods between Nigeria and South Korea, but Margaret had never known the full extent of his dealings. "My father had nothing to do with people like you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He was an honest man." Kang Min-jun's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Your father was many things, Margaret, but purely honest was not one of them. He made a blood pact with me 5 years ago, a covenant that bound our families together in business. When he died, that covenant did not die with him. It passed to his heir, it passed to you." Margaret shook her head, backing away until her shoulders hit the wall. "That's insane. I never agreed to anything. You can't just kidnap me and claim I belong to you because of some agreement I knew nothing about." "I can, and I have," he replied simply. "Without my protection, Margaret, you are worth nothing, worse than nothing. You are a liability that my enemies would love to exploit. Your family knew this. That is why your mother and uncle did not intervene. That is why Choi Dae-sung sold you to me instead of marrying you and trying to claim your father's assets for himself." The words struck her like bullets. "Sold me? He sold me?" Her voice was barely a whisper now, the full horror of her situation finally sinking in. "How much? How much was I worth to him?" Kang Min-jun studied her for a long moment before answering. 5 million won, and his miserable life. He had debts to very dangerous people, Margaret. I offered him a way out, and he took it eagerly. 5 million won, roughly $4,000. That was what her love, her trust, her entire future had been worth to the man who had promised to cherish her forever. Margaret felt something break inside her, something fundamental that she knew would never be whole again. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, and she began to laugh. It was a broken, terrible sound that quickly turned into sobs. Kang Min-jun watched her cry without moving, without offering comfort. When her tears finally subsided, he spoke again. "There are rules here, Margaret. You will follow them. You will not try to escape. You will not contact anyone from your old life. And when I need you, you will fulfill the role your father promised you would play. In return, I will keep you alive, fed, and protected from those who would use you against me. Do you understand?" She looked up at him through tear-swollen eyes. "What role? What am I supposed to do?" He turned toward the door, his men opening it immediately. "You will learn soon enough. Rest now. You have a long journey ahead of you." The days that followed blurred together. In a haze of grief and rage, Margaret was moved to a room in what she eventually realized was an enormous mansion on the outskirts of Seoul. The room was luxurious compared to her cell, with a comfortable bed, private bathroom, and even a small window that looked out over a manicured garden. But it was still a prison. The door was locked from the outside, and armed guards stood in the hallway at all times. She was brought 3 meals a day by silent staff who would not meet her eyes or answer her questions. At first, she refused to eat, hoping to starve herself into freedom or death, whichever came first. But Kang Min-jun simply had his men force-feed her, holding her down while they poured broth down her throat, and she realized that even this small rebellion would be taken from her. On the 5th day, or perhaps it was the 6th, Kang Min-jun came to her room carrying a torn leather journal. He placed it on the bed beside her and stood back, his hands clasped behind his back. "This belonged to your father," he said. "I thought you might want to read it. Perhaps it will help you understand." Margaret stared at the journal as if it were a snake. She recognized it immediately. Her father had always carried it with him, writing in it during quiet moments, but she had never been allowed to read it. After his death, her mother had said it was lost. Now she knew that had been another lie in a long line of lies that had shaped her entire life. She picked up the journal with trembling hands and opened it to a random page. Her father's familiar handwriting sprawled across the yellowed paper, and as she began to read, the truth of her situation became horrifyingly clear. Her father had not just been a businessman, he had been a middleman, facilitating deals between Nigerian suppliers and Korean criminal organizations. He had moved money, weapons, and information across borders, and he had made a fortune doing it. But 5 years ago, a deal had gone wrong. People had died, including Kang Min-jun's wife and unborn child. To prevent an all-out war that would have destroyed both families, her father had made a blood covenant, promising that his heir would serve as a living bond between the organizations, a guarantee of good faith and continued cooperation. Margaret read through the night, her hands shaking, tears blurring the words. Her father had written about his guilt, his fear, his desperate hope that he could somehow break the covenant before it came time to fulfill it. But he had died before he could find a way out, leaving Margaret to pay the price for his sins. The last entry was dated 2 days before his death. "I have failed my daughter," he had written. "I have bound her to a fate worse than death, and I can see no way to free her. Forgive me, Margaret. Forgive me for being too weak, too greedy, too foolish." Kang Min-jun is a hard man, but he is a man of his word. He will protect you, even if he cannot love you. It is poor comfort, I know, but it is all I can offer from beyond the grave. When Kang Min-jun returned in the morning, he found Margaret sitting exactly where he had left her, the journal open in her lap, her eyes red and hollow. "Now you understand," he said quietly. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she truly saw him. He was younger than she had initially thought, probably in his early 30s, with sharp features and a scar that ran along his left jawline. His eyes, which she had thought were cold and dead, actually held a deep, ancient pain that she recognized because she now carried the same weight. "You lost your wife," she said, her voice hoarse. "In my father's deal." He nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. "Her name was Ji-woo. She was 6 months pregnant with our son." Margaret closed the journal slowly. "Then why are you keeping me alive? Why not just kill me and have your revenge?" Kang Min-jun walked to the window and looked out at the garden, his back to her. "Because revenge is a fire that consumes everything, Margaret, including the one who lights it. Your father paid for his mistakes with his life, whether you believe that or not. His heart attack was too convenient, too perfectly timed to be natural. Someone wanted him dead, and I have my suspicions about who. But the covenant remains. Without it, without you, every deal your father ever brokered falls apart. Wars will break out. Territories will be contested. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people will die. You are not just my captive, Margaret. You are the only thing standing between peace and chaos." The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like iron chains. "So I'm supposed to just accept this? Give up my life, my freedom, my future, all because my father made a deal with the devil?" He turned back to face her, and something flickered in his eyes. Anger, perhaps, or maybe respect. "No one is asking you to accept it, Margaret. I am telling you this is your reality now. What you do with that knowledge is up to you, but understand this. Every guard in this house, every man who works for me, has been given the same order. You are to be protected at all costs. Not because I care about you personally, but because your life is worth more than all of ours combined. That is your father's legacy, and now it is your burden to bear." Weeks passed, and Margaret began to understand the strange world she had been forced into. She was a prisoner, yes, but she was also treated with a deference that confused her. The guards bowed when she passed. The staff addressed her respectfully. When she demanded books, they appeared. When she asked for different food, Korean dishes instead of the Nigerian meals they had initially tried to provide, her wishes were granted. She realized slowly that she had power here, even if it was a power she had never wanted. Kang Min-jun came to her room every few days, always bringing news or documents that required her attention. She was expected to sign contracts, to approve deals, to lend her name and her father's legacy to business transactions she barely understood. At first, she refused everything, signing nothing, approving nothing, but Kang Min-jun never forced her. He simply explained the consequences of each refusal. If she did not sign this contract, a shipment of medical supplies would not reach a hospital in Lagos. If she did not approve this deal, a Nigerian community in Busan would lose their protection and face deportation. He made it clear that her choices had real consequences for real people, and slowly, she began to participate not because she wanted to, but because she could not bear the guilt of inaction. It was manipulation of the cruelest kind, and she hated him for it, even as she acknowledged his terrible logic. One evening, after signing another stack of documents, Margaret threw the pen across the room in frustration. "When does this end? When do I get to have a life again?" Kang Min-jun, who had been standing by the door as he always did, picked up the pen and placed it back on the desk. "When the covenant is fulfilled," he said. "When?" she demanded, standing up to face him. "Give me a date. Give me something to hope for." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. 3 months from now, there is a meeting. The heads of 5 families will gather to finalize the last of your father's outstanding agreements. You must be there. You must represent the Okafor name and seal the contracts with your blood, literally. Once that is done, the covenant is considered fulfilled, and you will be free to go. Margaret's heart leaped at the word free, but then his words sank in fully. My blood? What does that mean? Kang Minjun's jaw tightened. It is an old tradition. A small cut on your palm, your blood pressed to the seal of the contract. It is symbolic, but in our world, symbols are everything. The other families will want to see that you are real, that you are willing to honor your father's promises. If you refuse, or if something happens to you before that meeting, the covenant is void, and everything falls apart. She sank back into her chair, her brief hope crashing around her. And if I do this, if I play my part in this barbaric ritual, then what? You'll just let me walk away? Yes, he said simply. You will be given money, a new identity if you want it, and passage to anywhere in the world you wish to go. I will have fulfilled my obligation to your father, and you will have fulfilled yours. We will never see each other again. The finality in his voice should have been comforting, but instead, Margaret felt a strange emptiness. 3 months suddenly seemed both impossibly far away and frighteningly close. What happens between now and then? She asked quietly. Kang Min-jun moved toward the door, his hand on the handle. You survive, Margaret. You learn what you need to know to play your part convincingly. And you pray that none of my enemies discover how valuable you truly are. The training began the next day. Kang Min-jun assigned a woman named Su Jin to teach Margaret the intricacies of Korean business etiquette, the proper way to bow, how to address different ranks within the organization, and most importantly, how to recognize danger. Su Jin was in her 50s, elegant and sharp-eyed, and she treated Margaret with a mixture of sympathy and stern discipline. The meeting will be dangerous, Su Jin told her during one of their sessions. These men are not like Kang Min-jun. They are older, more traditional, and they will not want to see a Nigerian woman holding power that they believe should belong to a Korean man. You must be perfect, Margaret. One mistake, one sign of weakness, and they will tear you apart. Margaret absorbed everything like a sponge, driven by the knowledge that her life depended on it. She learned to read the subtle body language that indicated respect or threat. She practiced the ceremonial phrases she would need to recite. She memorized the names and faces of the 5 family heads who would attend the meeting, learning their histories, their grudges, their alliances. At night, alone in her room, she would stand by the window and look out at the lights of Seoul in the distance, wondering if she would survive long enough to see the city as a free woman. The thought of freedom became her lifeline, the only thing that kept her from drowning in despair. As the weeks passed, Margaret began to notice changes in Kang Min-jun as well. He spent more time in her presence, sometimes sitting in silence while she studied, other times engaging her in conversations that had nothing to do with business. He asked about her life in Lagos, her childhood, her dreams before everything fell apart. She was wary at first, suspecting manipulation, but his interest seemed genuine. In turn, she found herself curious about him, about the man behind the cold mask. Why did you become this? She asked him one evening. Why choose this life? He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then he said, I did not choose it. I inherited it, just as you inherited your burden. My father built this organization, and when he died, I was expected to take his place. I was 22 years old and did not want any of it. I wanted to be an architect, to build beautiful things instead of tearing them down. But duty is not something you can walk away from in my world. Margaret felt an unexpected kinship with him in that moment. They were both prisoners of their father's choices, both carrying weights they had never asked for. What was she like? Margaret asked softly. Jiwoo. Kang Min-jun's expression shuddered immediately, the walls slamming back into place. That is not something I discuss, he said coldly, standing up to leave. But at the door, he paused. She was everything good that I was not. She made me believe I could be more than what my father had made me. When she died, that belief died with her. He left before Margaret could respond, but his words stayed with her long into the night. The weeks turned into months, and Margaret found herself caught in a strange paradox. She was counting down the days until her freedom, but she was also becoming more enmeshed in this world with each passing day. She attended meetings with Kang Min-jun, sitting silently as he negotiated deals and settled disputes. She saw the respect his men had for him, the fear his enemies held, and the weight of responsibility he carried on his shoulders. She watched him make impossible choices, sacrificing his own desires for the good of the organization, and she began to understand why her father had trusted him with the covenant. Kang Min-jun was brutal when he had to be, but he was also fair, loyal, and utterly incapable of breaking his word. One night, unable to sleep, Margaret left her room and wandered the mansion's halls. She had not tried to escape in weeks, partly because she knew it was futile, but mostly because she had nowhere to go. Her old life was gone, burned to ash by Daesung's betrayal and her family's complicity. She found herself in a wing of the house she had never explored before, drawn by the sound of piano music. Following the melody, she came to a room with the door slightly ajar. Inside, Kang Min-jun sat at a grand piano, his fingers moving over the keys with surprising grace. The music was melancholy and beautiful, filled with a longing that made her chest ache. She must have made a sound because he stopped playing immediately, his head snapping toward the door. When he saw her, his expression cycled through surprise, irritation, and then resignation. "You should not be here," he said, but there was no real anger in his voice. Margaret stepped into the room, drawn by curiosity and something else she could not name. "I did not know you played," she said. He looked down at the keys, his hands resting on them but no longer playing. "It is the one thing I kept from my old life, from before I became this. Ji-woo loved music. She used to sit right where you are standing and listen to me play for hours." Margaret moved closer, her bare feet silent on the polished wood floor. "Play something for me," she said softly. "Please." He looked at her, and for a moment she thought he would refuse. Then his hands moved again, and a new melody filled the room. This one was different from the first, less sorrowful and more hopeful, like the first light of dawn after a long, dark night. Margaret closed her eyes and let the music wash over her, feeling something inside her begin to thaw. When the last note faded, she opened her eyes to find him watching her. "Thank you," she whispered. Kang Min-jun stood abruptly, putting distance between them. "You should go back to your room. The meeting is in 2 weeks. You need to be rested." But as she turned to leave, he spoke again. "Margaret." She looked back at him. "You have done well these past months. You are stronger than I expected. Your father would be proud." It was the first personal compliment he had given her, and it hit harder than she anticipated. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and fled back to her room where she cried into her pillow, overwhelmed by emotions she could not untangle. The final 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and mounting tension. The meeting would take place in an abandoned warehouse near the port, neutral territory that belonged to none of the families. Margaret was given a traditional Korean hanbok to wear, black silk embroidered with silver thread, a symbol of mourning for her father and the weight of the covenant she carried. Sujin helped her dress the morning of the meeting, her hands gentle but her face grave. "Be brave, child," she said, adjusting the fabric across Margaret's shoulders. "And remember, no matter what happens, do not show fear. These men are like predators. They can smell weakness." Kang Min-jun came to collect her personally, flanked by 6 of his most trusted men. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Are you ready?" he asked. Margaret took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and nodded. "I have no choice but to be ready." They drove through Seoul in a convoy of black cars, and Margaret watched the city pass by the tinted windows, wondering if this would be the last time she saw it. When they arrived at the warehouse, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty lot. Inside, the space had been transformed. Long tables formed a rectangle, with chairs positioned for the 5 family heads and their advisors. At the center of the rectangle was a single chair, isolated and exposed. That was where Margaret would sit. The other families began to arrive, and Margaret felt the weight of their stares. These were dangerous men, their faces hard and their eyes calculating. They spoke in low voices, assessing her, judging her, and she could feel their contempt like a physical thing. A woman, a foreigner, a black woman at that, sitting in a position of power in their world. It was an insult to everything they believed in. Kang Min-jun stayed close to her, a silent presence at her back, and she drew strength from his proximity. When everyone was seated, the eldest of the family heads, a man named Baek Jin-ho stood and addressed the room. "We are here to finalize the covenant made by Adekunle Okafor and to determine if his heir is worthy of the trust he placed in her." Margaret stood, her legs steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I am Margaret Okafor," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I come to honor my father's word and to seal the agreements he made on behalf of both our families." Baek Jin-ho smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Words are easy, Miss Okafor. We require proof of your commitment. You will seal each contract with your blood, and you will do so before all of us as witnesses. Only then will the covenant be considered fulfilled." A man brought forward a small, ornate knife and a stack of documents. Margaret's heart pounded as she realized what was about to happen. She would have to cut her own palm 5 times, once for each contract, and press her bloody handprint to the seals. She looked back at Kang Min-jun, seeking reassurance, and found him watching her with an intensity that took her breath away. He gave her a single, small nod. "You can do this." Margaret turned back to the table, picked up the knife, and before she could think too much about it, drew the blade across her left palm. The pain was sharp and immediate, blood welling up and spilling over her fingers. She pressed her palm to the first document, leaving a bright red print, then moved to the second, and the third. By the fourth, her vision was starting to blur, and by the fifth, she was swaying on her feet. But she remained standing, refusing to show weakness. When it was done, Baek Jin-ho examined each document carefully, then nodded. "The covenant is sealed. Adekunle Okafor's debt is paid." But before Margaret could feel relief, the warehouse doors burst open. Men poured in, dozens of them, wearing the colors of a rival organization. Gunfire erupted, shattering the tense formality of the meeting. Margaret was thrown to the ground as Kang Min-jun shielded her with his own body, his gun already in his hand. The room descended into chaos, bullets flying, men shouting, and the smell of gunpowder filling the air. Someone had betrayed the meeting's location, turning what should have been a sacred gathering into a battlefield. Kang Min-jun dragged Margaret behind an overturned table, his men forming a protective circle around them. "Stay down," he ordered, firing at the attackers with deadly precision. Margaret pressed her bleeding hand against her chest, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She could hear men dying around her, their screams mixing with the constant crack of gunfire. This was the reality of the world she had been forced into, the violence that lurked beneath every deal and every promise. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying to survive, praying that it would end soon. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The attackers retreated, leaving behind bodies and the acrid smell of smoke. Kang Min-jun checked Margaret for injuries, his hands surprisingly gentle as he examined her bleeding palm. "We need to leave now," he said urgently. This was a message. Someone does not want the covenant fulfilled. They fled the warehouse, leaving the surviving family heads to deal with their own wounded. The drive back to the mansion was tense and silent, Margaret's mind reeling from what she had just witnessed. She had sealed the covenant. She had survived. By all rights, she should be free now. But as they pulled through the mansion gates, she realized that freedom was suddenly the last thing on her mind. In her room, a doctor treated her hand, stitching the wound closed while Margaret sat in numb shock. Kang Min-jun stood by the window, his back rigid, his jaw clenched. When the doctor left, silence filled the space between them. Finally, Margaret spoke. "The covenant is fulfilled. I did what I was supposed to do. He did not turn around. Yes. So I can leave now. That was the agreement. Yes," he said again, his voice flat. Margaret stood, her bandaged hand throbbing with pain. "Then why do you look like you are going to a funeral?" He turned then, and the expression on his face stopped her breath. It was raw, unguarded, filled with a conflict that she had never seen him show before. "Because I am," he said quietly, "I am watching you walk out of my life, and I have just realized that I do not want you to go." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Margaret's heart stuttered in her chest. "You do not mean that. You are just feeling responsible for me because of the covenant." Kang Min-jun crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "I stopped feeling responsible weeks ago, Margaret. What I feel now is something I swore I would never feel again after Ji-woo died. You have made me remember what it is like to want something beyond duty and revenge. You have made me feel human again, and I hate you for it even as I cannot imagine letting you go." Margaret's breath caught. She should be angry. She should be running as far from this man and this world as possible. But instead, she found herself reaching up with her good hand to touch his face, her fingers tracing the scar on his jaw. "I should hate you," she whispered. "You took everything from me." His hand came up to cover hers, holding it against his cheek. "I know, I do not expect forgiveness. I do not deserve it. But I am asking you to stay, not as a prisoner, not because of the covenant, but because I want you here. Because in these months, you have become the one thing in my life that makes sense." She looked into his eyes and saw the truth there, the vulnerability he was offering her, and she felt something shift inside herself. The anger and grief that had sustained her for so long began to crack, revealing something else underneath. Hope, maybe, or the possibility of it. "I do not know how to forgive you," she said honestly. "I do not know if I ever can, but I also do not know how to leave." Kang Min-jun leaned his forehead against hers, his eyes closing. "Then do not. Stay. Let me spend however long it takes earning your forgiveness. Let me show you that there is more to this life than the darkness you have seen." Margaret closed her eyes too, feeling the warmth of him, the solid reality of his presence. It was insane. It was impossible. She should be planning her escape, not standing here considering a future with the man who had destroyed her old life. But maybe, she thought, her old life had needed to be destroyed. Maybe the naive girl who had stood at that altar was never meant to survive in the real world. Maybe she had needed to be broken down and rebuilt into someone stronger, someone who could stand beside a man like Kang Min-jun and not flinch from the darkness. "I need time," she finally said, pulling back to look at him. "I need to figure out who I am now, separate from the covenant, separate from what my father made me." He nodded slowly, his hand falling away from hers. "Take all the time you need. I will be here." And so began a new chapter, one without contracts or blood oaths, but filled with its own uncertainties. Margaret did not leave the mansion, but she stopped being a prisoner. She started exploring Seoul, always with guards for her protection, but with the freedom to go where she pleased. She enrolled in business classes at a university, determined to understand the world she had been thrust into on her own terms. She started writing again, something she had loved in her old life, filling notebooks with her thoughts and slowly processing the trauma she had endured. Kang Min-jun gave her space but never disappeared entirely. He would leave books he thought she might enjoy on her desk. He would join her for dinner occasionally, their conversations slowly moving from stilted and awkward to something approaching comfortable. He never pushed, never demanded, just waited with a patience she had not known he possessed. Slowly, cautiously, Margaret began to let her guard down. She started asking him questions about the organization, about the decisions he made and why. She began to see the impossible position he was in, the weight of responsibility that never lifted from his shoulders. 6 months after the warehouse meeting, Margaret opened a small restaurant in Itaewon, Seoul's international district. It served Nigerian food, the flavors of her childhood, and it became a haven for the Nigerian community in Korea. It was her declaration of independence, proof that she could build something of her own in this city that had been her prison. Kang Min-jun came to the opening, sitting quietly in a corner booth, and when she brought him a plate of jollof rice and egusi soup, he ate every bite and told her it was the best meal he had ever had. She knew he was lying, but the gesture touched her anyway. One evening, as she was closing up the restaurant, Kang Min-jun appeared at the door. He looked nervous, an expression she had never seen on him before. "I need to show you something," he said. "Will you come with me?" "Curious," Margaret agreed. They drove to a building in Gangnam, and when they went inside, she realized it was an apartment, beautifully furnished with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Han River. "What is this?" she asked. Kang Min-jun put a key in her hand. "It is yours. I bought it for you. I know you have been staying at the mansion out of convenience, but I wanted you to have a place that was completely your own, with no strings attached. You can live here, or you can sell it, or you can burn it down if you want. It is yours to do with as you please." Margaret stood in the middle of the living room, overwhelmed. It was the most thoughtful, generous thing anyone had ever done for her. "Why?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. He moved to stand by the window, his hands in his pockets. Because you deserve something beautiful that is untouched by the ugliness of my world. Because I want you to know that I see you, Margaret. Not as a covenant or a responsibility, but as a woman who has survived things that would have broken most people. You are extraordinary, and I wanted to give you something that reflected that. She walked over to him, her heart pounding. Kang Min-jun, she said softly, using his full name deliberately. He turned to face her, and she saw the hope and fear warring in his eyes. Yes? She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I forgive you. I do not know when it happened exactly, probably somewhere between the piano music and the jollof rice, but I forgive you. And more than that, I think I am falling in love with you, which is absolutely insane considering how we met. His expression transformed, the stoic mask falling away completely to reveal raw, unfiltered joy. Margaret, he breathed, reaching for her. She stepped into his arms, and when he kissed her, it was like coming home and leaping off a cliff all at once. It was terrifying and exhilarating and perfect. All the months of tension, all the careful distance they had maintained, dissolved in that moment. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Margaret laughed. A real, genuine laugh that came from somewhere deep inside. What is funny? Kang Min-jun asked, his forehead resting against hers. Everything, she said. All of this. The fact that I am standing here in love with the man who kidnapped me from my wedding. The fact that the worst day of my life led to this moment. It is absurd. He smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face, making him look years younger. Absurd but real, he said. I love you, Margaret Okafor. I will spend the rest of my life proving that I deserve your love in return. And he did. Their relationship was not easy. There were days when Margaret's trauma resurfaced, when she could not stand to be touched, or when nightmares of the warehouse plagued her sleep. There were days when Kang Min-jun's world intruded, when his responsibilities pulled him away, or when danger threatened them both. But through it all, they held on to each other, building something real and lasting from the ashes of their broken past. Margaret's restaurant thrived, becoming a gathering place not just for Nigerians, but for anyone seeking authentic food and genuine warmth. Kang Min-jun slowly began to step back from the more violent aspects of his organization, using his power to shift toward legitimate businesses. It was a slow transformation, one that would take years, but Margaret was his compass, guiding him toward the man he had once wanted to be before duty had claimed him. They were both works in progress, both scarred by the choices of their fathers, but together they were building something new, something hopeful. On the anniversary of the day they met, Kang Min-jun took Margaret back to the church where she had been taken. It had been closed for months, but he had arranged for them to go inside. Why are we here? Margaret asked, her voice echoing in the empty space. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over the scar on her palm from the covenant sealing. Because this is where your old life ended, and I wanted to give you a chance to say goodbye to who you were before. You are not that frightened bride anymore, Margaret. You are someone so much stronger, so much more incredible. I wanted you to see that. She looked around the church, remembering the terror and betrayal she had felt that day. But the memories had less power now. They were part of her story, but they no longer defined her. You are right, she said softly. I am not that person anymore. She died here, and someone new was born. She turned to face him. Someone who is not afraid of the darkness because she has learned to carry her own light. Kang Min-jun pulled her close, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And in that moment, in that place where her nightmare had begun, Margaret felt truly free for the first time since everything had fallen apart. She had survived. She had forgiven. She had found love in the most impossible place, and her future, once stolen and then gradually reclaimed, now stretched out before her full of endless possibility.